So welcome to this section where we're going to be writing our first endpoint, our first REST endpoint in our Spring Boot application. So what we've done until now, so we've downloaded IntelliJ, initialized the Spring Boot project, started up the project, and we have the application running, but we don't really have anything mapped, or we don't have any mapping. If I were to go and hit that URL, so if I go to localhost 8080 and hit that URL here in the browser, and if I click enter, we're gonna get this white label error page, basically the 404. So basically we're getting the 404 not found because we don't have anything mapped on the slash. And what are we gonna do in this video? We're gonna be writing our first RESTful endpoint, or let's say the first endpoint that we're gonna be able to access here and actually get some data back. So I'm gonna go into IntelliJ. I will, let me just switch to IntelliJ. I will stop the application for now. Let's just close some of these files because we're not gonna need them. I'm gonna come here to the project structure and I'm gonna go to the main package that we have here, and I'm gonna add another package that I'm gonna name web. And in the web package, I'm gonna add a controller, and the controller, I'm just gonna name it for this case test controller. So just test controller, and this is where we're gonna specify an endpoint or a handler for endpoint that we're gonna be able to access. Now for this tutorial, for this video actually, for this section, we're just gonna create one endpoint and we're gonna access it in the browser, but for the next videos we're going to be going over the different types of HTTP methods in the endpoints and how to actually implement them here in the controller. So in order to specify that this class is going to be a controller, we're going to have to annotate it with the annotation, in this case REST controller. Now there's two annotations. There's just the controller annotation, and that's in the case if we're building a Spring MVC application. But for this tutorial, we're going to be building a REST API, so that's why we're going to stick to the REST controller annotation. So I'm just going to choose the REST controller annotation, and like that, this class now is a controller. So it's annotated with the controller, so it will get created into a bin. When the application starts up, and we're gonna have the controller that currently doesn't have any endpoints, any mappings, but we will have it running as a bin, as a controller. Now, in order to specify an endpoint, what we need to do is we need to add a method here. In this case, let's say we're gonna have a get mapping. So for the HTTP get method, so that you specify with also with an annotation. In this case, that's gonna be the get mapping annotation. After you've specified the annotation, you can specify the handler method. So that's gonna be a public, and it's gonna return a response entity. So that's what we usually return from a controller. For the purposes of this video, or for this section, I'm just gonna return a plain string wrapped in a response entity, and I'm just gonna name the method getTest. And what I'm gonna return just a response entity .ok. So this .ok is gonna give it a status 200, and I'm just gonna say test. Now notice we didn't really give it any mapping. So now what I'm gonna first do is I'm gonna add a controller level mapping, or where the route's gonna be mapped for this controller. So that's gonna be a request mapping annotation, and here we can specify the path. So I'm just gonna name it API. So this is gonna be like /API, let's say /test. And now this is the mapping for this controller. We can also add a specific mapping here in the get mapping if we want something specific, but for now we're not gonna add. So basically we're just gonna have the annotation get mapping and the controller request mapping API /test. So let's see right now, what do we have? So we have a controller that's annotated with a REST controller. It has the request mapping annotation at the top, and we have one method that's a public. It returns a response entity with a string, And that's exactly what we do. So we create a response entity, and basically .ok means that it's going to be a status 200, and we are just returning a body of string. This is going to get mapped to this route right here. If you want something more specific, in addition to this, we need to specify it here as I showed before. But now, when I start the application, so I'm just going to start it up right now. I'm just going to click on the debug and wait for it to start up right here. So it's gonna start up. As you can see, it started up. And now if I go in the browser, and if we go in the root, obviously we're gonna get the 404 again. I mean, that's expected. We don't have really anything mapped on the slash. But if I go on the slash API slash test, which is this mapping right here for the controller, we should expect to get back this handler here. Like, it should reach this handler and it should return the test string here that we have. So let me just click enter here, and that's exactly what happened. So we got back the test string right over here on our first endpoint. And that's kinda gonna be for this video. So that's gonna be all for this video. So we wrote our first endpoint, and in the next one we're gonna be taking a look at how we can add some query parameters to the request and how we can access them here in the controller. But that's gonna be it for this section.